Of John Hughes' teenage slice of life collection, The Breakfast Club, I think, is his most thoughtful because even if the archetypes represented in The Breakfast Club take different forms as generations of students define themselves in new ways, the whole point is how general those distinctions are when you actually get to know someone, like we see these characters do in this arbitrary Saturday morning detention. What dissolves the barriers that typically divide them is when they discover a commonality. They're each trying to manage the expectations that have been assigned to them by their parents, society, or themselves. The presumption with so many high school films and series is that the characters fit the roles of the cliche archetypes by choice. But in The Breakfast Club, the students are aware of the roles they are filling, and whether they want to fill these roles or not, they can't change them regardless. That's why it's so easy to sympathize with John and Allison more than Claire and Andrew, because in this library, the dividing lines are exposed as not only irrelevant, but also completely superficial. And this doesn't happen by accident. After we learn who each character is just by how they arrive at the school, and then how they react to the principal's orientation, John begins to hold court. Until Andrew says something to John that is brutal, and from Andrew's perspective, the ultimate slam.
You know, Bender, you don't even count. And if you disappear forever, it wouldn't make any difference. You may as well not even exist at this school. Well.
And then John looks away, and it cuts to Allison, because this line is about her too. Just a few minutes before that, John said to Allison,
"I've seen you before, you know."
Just to remind her that he isn't like the others. And then he looks at her while Andrew is demeaning him to his face, like it wasn't already apparent to them that this popular crowd has an absolute shameless superiority complex. If there's one thing I dislike about this movie, it is that Allison needs the bullshit Easter picnic glow up at the end in order to be seen by Andrew. That whole part does not exist in my mind. But anyway, Andrew says that nasty line to John because John is antagonizing the core of each character's loyalties. Activities, popularity, clubs, sports, and then the first chance John gets, he takes the screw out of the door to reveal the principal's authoritarian perspective towards the students as a monolith. John earns them privacy in closing the door, and the students cover for John after being captive to witnessing the cruelty and spite of the principal.
Who closed that door?
I think a screw fell out of it.
It just closed, sir.
Who?
John is like a high school sleeper cell, infiltrating the hierarchy from the principal on down to eventually topple it while maintaining this disguise as a social pariah. Instead of conforming, John undermines the authority of the principal, indoctrinates the population, and forms a rebellion. Claire becomes less superficial. The jock becomes even more annoying, but also more vulnerable. The brainiac smokes pot, and Allison is seen by her peers for the first time. And the film ends with John celebrating some ephemeral victory after earning the respect of his peers for once, against all odds, as always. But this was just a random detention on a Saturday. The temporary nature of it reflects the nature of any short-lived victories these high schoolers could have, whether that's being respected by their peers or parents, or being perfect in school or with sports. And while there's something like a melancholic happiness at the end when Bender's fist freeze frames in the air, it's also bittersweet because the victory will only last as long as his fist stays in the air. It is a club that begins and ends on the same day. It's easy to sympathize with John because he's the victim of this hierarchy more than anyone else, something that is stated perfectly by the principal saying to the other students,
Let me tell you something. Look at him. He's a bum. You want to see something funny? You go visit John Bender in 5 years. You'll see how goddamn funny he is.
Bender, more than any other character, is seeing how people want to see him and not for who he is. The principal, in charge of the only institution that could influence John in the right direction, tells John that the institution itself is the only thing keeping the principal from physically assaulting John.
That's right. And I'm gonna kick the living shit out of you, man. I'm gonna knock your dick in the dirt.
A scene that really draws the contrast between the students is when they're all sitting near the railing and Claire and Andrew are talking about whether or not they would drive to school naked. The camera pans to Allison and John, completely apathetic, and then Allison lies about being a nymphomaniac to entertain herself and drive a wedge into their trivial back and forth. And then a few minutes later, Claire does the show and tell trick with her lipstick, and that's when John had enough. It's like Claire and Andrew are humbling themselves to be around this group of inferiors that should feel so lucky to have them in their presence, and oh, here's a little trick for you to be entertained by. But John sees right through it. By not forfeiting the default admiration that is expected of him, he makes the point that whatever she is doing isn't special. He isn't just going to play along and give her credit because she can humble herself for a few minutes.
You don't like me anyway.
You know, I have just as many feelings as you do, and it hurts just as much when somebody steps all over them.
God, you're so pathetic. Don't you ever compare yourself to me, okay? You got everything, and I got shit.
But that's when Claire reveals that she herself doesn't even want to be a mean girl.
I hate it. I hate having to go along with everything my friends say.
Then why do you do it?
I don't...
She also hates the social hierarchy they have all been molded and defined by, but she doesn't know how to change. While John is the protagonist of the film, Claire's the heart of it because she's captive to this system too. She says, "You're not friends with the same group of people me and Andy are friends with. You don't know what type of pressure they can put on you." She plays the part because she has to. She's human, and humans make choices that are the ones expected of them. She's surrounded by the people she is supposed to be friends with, which is the best she can hope for, because the opposite end of that spectrum is having nobody, being invisible. For generations, there will be students with the same problems, separated by lines in the sand that will go on to define them as individuals. Brian says, "You see us as you want to see us," because students are who they are told they are, regardless of what they would choose for themselves in the paradoxical freedom of a Saturday morning detention where they are forced to confront social constructs that do not exist. The roles are arbitrarily the same as they have always been, and the cycle repeats itself. As much as John made fun of clubs at the beginning of the film, he finds himself in one by the end of it, even if these 5 students will never meet like this again as they return to the monolith they are seen as.